I'm Elizabeth Mannick. I go by Betsy, and I work with RTI as a Regulatory Affairs Director. Today, we're going to talk about how to prepare for a pre-IND and an interact meeting with the FDA. And before we get started, I just thought if people would put in the chat, if you've had a pre-IND or an interact meeting, please type yes in the chat, just to get a sense. So I don't see many yeses here. Um, so that's good for me to know. I did pitch this more towards people who have not had a meeting yet. Next. So why do you need a pre-IND and or an interact meeting with the FDA? Well, the truth is you do not have to have one. FDA does not require you to have one. But it is a good idea to have one and or both of these meetings, especially if you have a new molecular entity or you're working with a drug that's not previously approved, and especially if you're new to drug development. So why? Well, you get free targeted advice from the FDA that can help you to avoid costly mistakes or delays. And a meeting can help establish rapport and trust with your FDA review division, who are going to be following you along the whole trajectory of your drug's development. Next. So the FDA on their website gives their perspective on the benefits of a pre-IND meeting. And there's a long list here: avoiding unnecessary studies, ensuring that necessary studies are designed to provide useful information, gaining FDA support for a proposed strategy, providing opportunity for creative exchange of ideas, obtaining regulatory insight, minimizing costs, clearly defining endpoints, allowing early interactions. But right there in the middle is the clincher: minimizing potential for clinical hold. So that's the one you need to remember. Why do you need to meet with the FDA? So they don't shut your drug development program down in the middle of one of your studies. That's something that we all want to avoid. Next slide. So there's several types of FDA meetings that you've probably heard about. These aren't inclusive of all of them, but type A meeting, again, a meeting that you hope not to have, in which you discuss stalled drug development with the FDA, usually caused by a clinical hold, or what we call a complete response letter, or a CR, which means a rejection of your new drug application. Type B meeting is to discuss clinical development plans just prior to entering phase 1, 2, 3, or prior to submitting NDA and BLA. Type C meeting is to discuss any other developmental issues. It's a very common type of meeting. And type D meeting, which is relatively new, is a very focused discussion of only one or two targeted issues. Finally, the interact meeting, also a newer type of meeting in which you discuss early stage development issues. Next. So what is a pre-IND meeting? It's the pre-investigational new drug application meeting. It's a type B meeting. You typically only have one of these meetings, but there's nothing in the statutes that say you cannot have more than one, but typically only one. This occurs usually about 1 year before your IND submission, when you have preclinical proof of concept and preliminary safety studies completed, and when you've defined your manufacturing process, but before you do your definitive GLP tox studies. And how do you request this? You send a formal meeting request 60 days before the meeting. You receive a meeting request acceptance or rejection 21 days after this. And then you submit your briefing book or meeting package 30 days before the meeting. And it's best practice to have a first draft of your briefing book completed before you send off the meeting request, so there are no delays in submission of your briefing book. Next. And what topics do you want to discuss at your pre-IND meeting? Well, you want to talk about your preclinical results and the design of your definitive tox studies to support your first-in-human trials. You want to talk about any CMC manufacturing issues. You want to include a protocol synopsis, or in some cases, a complete protocol for your first-in-human trials, as well as a little sketch of your overall clinical development plan. You want to talk about your proposed dosing regimen. You want to talk about any other early development challenges and your plans to address them, and any questions on topics for which there's no published FDA guidance, which often pertains to these very novel products. Or you can ask questions if you think the FDA guidance is ambiguous. Next. Interact meeting is an initial targeted engagement for regulatory advice on CBER or CDER products. So it's only done at CBER or CDER. And you can only have one of these meetings. These are early development meetings, but you do need to know what your investigational product is, and you should have at least some preclinical proof of concept data. But you would not have designed or conducted definitive tox studies at this point. You send in your meeting request 75 days before the meeting. You get your acceptance or rejection 21 days after receipt of request, and you submit your briefing book, unlike the pre-IND meeting, with your meeting request. So it's just one submission, the meeting request and the briefing book, that takes place 75 days before your meeting. Next. So what topics do you want to talk about at your Interact meeting? Well, it's especially suited for questions about novel products and novel development programs. You want to talk about choosing appropriate preclinical models or toxicology studies. You want to talk about CMC requirements to demonstrate product safety adequate for first-in-human trials. You want to talk about the design of your proof of concept or other pilot safety studies. And you want general recommendations about a future first-in-human trial, but you don't have to submit a protocol synopsis, and especially if there's no FDA guidance on your product. And finally, it's suited for recommendations for an early stage product with CMC farm tox and or clinical data that was collected outside of a US IND. Next slide. So what if you don't want an Interact meeting because it's considered less binding than a type B or C meeting? Well, in this case, you can actually request a type C meeting in lieu of an Interact meeting. And technically, you can have more than one of these. And you can also request a type C meeting early in development before your pre-IND meeting. You send in your meeting request 75 days before the meeting. Then you get your acceptance or rejection 21 days later. And then you submit your briefing book 30 days before the meeting. But just remember, no FDA meeting is 100% binding, and the FDA can always change its mind. Next. So just a quick audience poll. Some of this is very dry and bureaucratic. True or false? You should schedule a pre-IND meeting with FDA as early in development as possible. Please reply in the chat. Okay, we're getting some trues and some falses, and this is false because actually you want to wait until you have proof of concept data and some safety data before your pre-IND meeting. You're going to do it typically a year before you submit your IND. So it was a little bit of a trick question there. Okay, next. One more. True or false? You should schedule an interact meeting 60 days before the meeting date because it's a type B meeting. Is that true or false? Good. Yep. Most people got this one. That's false. You should schedule it 75 days before the meeting date, and it is not a type B meeting. A pre-IND meeting is a type B meeting. Last poll. One more. True or false? Meeting request and briefing book are submitted at the same time for an interact meeting. Is that true or false? Yep. Okay. Everyone was awake and drinking their coffee. Let's move on. So how do I ask the FDA a question? And this is a non-trivial question, believe it or not, because asking a question of the FDA is highly scripted and formal. And at first, it may seem stilted to you. Next. So how do you ask them? Questions are typically yes or no questions, although you can use a little bit more out-of-the-box questioning in an interact meeting. And these questions typically begin with, does the FDA agree that X, Y, or Z is true and reasonable? So almost always you ask the agency if they agree with what you're proposing. And then after you ask the question, you give a rationale for why you think X, Y, and Z are reasonable. And frequently the FDA answers, no, we do not agree. If you hear this, do not be discouraged. This is normal FDA talk. After they say, no, we do not agree, that's when they give you their suggestions. They'll tell you what else you need to do or whether they completely disagree with what you're doing. But more typically, they'll add to what you're doing. And if you ever hear the words, yes, we agree from the FDA, by all means, go out and celebrate because it's uncommon. Next. So just remember, FDA are not regulatory or management consultants. So do not ask broad, open-ended questions such as, how does the FDA think the regulatory landscape for gene therapy will evolve in the next 5 years? Or what does the FDA think of our development plan? Or does the FDA think our product's viable? Don't ask those because they will not be answered. Next. And just remember, you need to limit the number of questions that you ask the FDA to 10 per meeting request. People used to use sub-questions to get around this. So they do question 1A, B, C, D, and E. And the FDA finally put a stop to that. So now you can't have sub-questions. And if you need to ask just a one-time informal question, consider reaching out to the regulatory project manager or the RPM, who's going to be your primary point of contact at FDA and who's usually easy to reach by email. And the RPM will let you know if you need a meeting or not to answer your question. Next. So how do I submit an FDA meeting request? It's a formal electronic submission through the FDA gateway for a pre-IND and an email submission for Interact through a special website. And it has multiple required sections: application number, product name, chemical name, proposed regulatory pathway, proposed indication, meeting type, pediatric study plans, human factors engineering plans, and suggested dates and times for your meeting. So you do have to include all of these, and please reach out to your regulatory affairs person for a template to make it easier for yourself. Although FDA gives very good guidance about how to do this on their website. Next. And most importantly, you're going to submit your list of proposed questions grouped by FDA discipline, meaning CMC, Pharm Tox, or clinical, with a brief explanation of the context and purpose of each question. And the meeting request must also include a proposed meeting format whether you want a face-to-face meeting, a video conference, a teleconference, or a written response only. For Interact meetings, they're almost always teleconferences, so you likely will not get a face-to-face meeting. You want to submit the date your meeting package and briefing book are going to be sent. And this is important, a brief statement of the purpose of the meeting, including a background of the issues and a summary of completed or planned studies and clinical trials, and data to be discussed at the meeting. And this part of your meeting request is often the longest. But you do want to keep your meeting request concise if you can. You also want to give an agenda, sponsor attendees, and you can request certain FDA attendees, especially if you want somebody outside the review division with specialized expertise to attend. Next. So what goes in a briefing book, otherwise known as a meeting package? Well, again, there are many templates available. You can ask us if you need one. There is no FDA guidance on exactly what a briefing book contains, but it usually contains the finalized questions, background information needed for the FDA to answer the questions, and for you to convey your position. Just remember the data should be summarized and succinct. Use tables and graphics when you can, and try not to exceed 50 pages. So remember too that you can't submit any new information once you submit your briefing book. That's it. If you get late breaking news, you're not allowed to put it in the briefing book or even present it at the meeting. Next. So what happens if you get this written response only from the FDA? First, don't panic. They don't give you a meeting, but they answer your questions in writing. It may mean that the FDA doesn't see any major problems with your plans. It can also mean that the review division is swamped with meetings. But you will receive a detailed written response to your questions by the date the meeting was requested. And the silver lining is you will have a final FDA position in writing 30 days earlier than you would have if you'd had a face-to-face meeting. Next. So 1 week before the meeting, counting down, the FDA will usually send preliminary responses to your questions 24 to 72 hours before the meeting, but sometimes even 5 days before the meeting. If the FDA's preliminary responses answer all your questions, you can choose to cancel the meeting. Most people do not because they want to get the context, the added context of hearing it from the horse's mouth. And if further clarification is needed for a question, the sponsor can notify the FDA Regulatory Project Manager, or RPM, about which questions need further discussion during the meeting. And most sponsors hold mock meetings to rehearse before the actual meeting. And it's helpful during these meetings to have someone play FDA reviewer. And if you know any people who used to be FDA reviewers, those are sometimes the best people you can choose. But that's not necessary. Anyone can play FDA reviewer. Next. And the meeting itself is scheduled for 1 hour. It's chaired by the FDA RPM. The first 5 minutes are introductions of FDA and sponsor attendees. But if you want more time to talk, you can waive the introductions. And the next 50 minutes are for discussion of the questions in the order requested. And generally, it's not a good idea to give a formal presentation, but instead have a sponsor subject matter expert for each question to give a brief exposition of their position and ask any clarifying questions to the FDA. And it's important, again, to list the primary concern questions first when you provide questions to the RPM. So if time runs out, these primary concerns have been discussed. The last 5 minutes of the meeting can be for a summary statement by the sponsor of takeaways and action items, somewhat what you understand to have been the outcome of the meeting. Next. So post-meeting to-dos, it's a good idea to write up your meeting minutes immediately after the meeting and circulate to the internal team for edits. You can send your minutes to the FDA, but that's not the norm at CDER and CBER. It's more common at CDRH. FDA will send you their final meeting minutes, which are the binding meeting minutes, within 30 days of the meeting. And it's best to wait to receive these to be sure that you understood the FDA advice correctly. And I would recommend scheduling a meeting with your team to digest them and parse through them. And then if you still don't understand something that the FDA is saying, you can submit a request for clarification within 20 days of receipt of the meeting minutes. Next. So take-home pearls. Do engage your regulatory team early. Do consider an interact meeting and a pre-IND meeting if your product is novel. It's a little more work, but it gives you 2 shots on goal. Familiarize yourself with FDA guidance on your drug product and give a lot of thought to the questions you will ask FDA and how you're going to ask them. So don't ask the FDA open-ended questions. Don't assume interactions with FDA are informal. Don't forget that Type C meeting is an option instead of an interact meeting. And don't be afraid to ask the FDA questions because you don't want to hear the answers. Sooner or later, they will answer you, so better get that answer early. Next. And now I think we probably have some time for